we've got a lot of things that need to be discussed.
Within the state, we've really been trying to, for many years, been trying to understand what's happening at different life stages.
What if southern New England had caught lobsters the way that fishermen in Maine have been catching lobsters?
Nothing better than putting the scientists in on vacation.
And so roughly in 20 years, the population will be what we call functionally extinct or unable to recover.
This will be the largest challenge for this industry.
People have been speculating about what warmer temperatures are going to mean for lobsters and what this might mean for this fishery, and I
think all of us in the program look at this as bullets in our gun.
We try to make sure we're listening more than talking, so that's my intent here today.
Welcome to a special edition of the Beyond Data podcast. In this episode, we're going to talk about the Maine Fishermen's Forum, which wrapped up this weekend. I'm your host, Rhett Talbot, and because many of you may be new to the podcast, allow me to take a moment at the beginning here to let you know what this podcast is all about. As a freelance journalist covering fisheries at the intersection of science and sustainability for more than a decade, I've tended to keep my reporting fairly rooted in the data. In fact, if you follow me on Twitter, you know that I often use the hashtag #DataMatter because, well, they do. But there are many stories I've researched over the years that have remained as a file in my file cabinet because the data either don't exist or were not accessible even after utilizing the tools investigative journalists commonly employ when chasing down a story. In the Beyond Data podcast, we delve into some of those stories, and while we always try to inform the conversation with the data, we also go beyond the data. In each episode, you'll likely hear from scientists, academics, legislators, and regulators, but you'll also hear from fishers, farmers, advocates, consumers, and, well, pretty much anyone who can provide insight into the issue we cover. So far in Season 1, we've taken deep dives into New York's oyster toadfish fishery, which is a cautionary tale perhaps even more relevant today than it was back in the 90s, meal kits and seafood sustainability, and non-native fishes through the lens of brown trout and brook trout. We are about to publish a story about the food sovereignty movement. But first, I want to share some thoughts with you about the current reporting we are doing on seafood and fisheries management here in New England. March is always a busy month for me as a journalist, covering first the Maine Fishermen's Forum, which just happened right here in the Mid-Coast, and then the Seafood Expo North America, which begins next weekend in Boston. Perhaps it will come as no surprise that episode 5 of the Beyond Data podcast, which we'll publish at the end of March, will be about seafood. And given the amount of reporting we're doing at these two events, I plan to bring you several special episodes like this one. So let's dive in. The Maine Fishermen's Forum formally started in 1976. If you have any interest in fisheries, working waterfronts, or seafood in general, you should plan to attend next year. To be clear, this is an event really geared towards those engaged in the commercial fishing industry here in Maine, but you'll also find an impressive roster of other stakeholders present, including federal and state regulators, scientists, legislators, and academics. Over the 3-day event, there are free seminars, a small trade show, and lots of social activities. The goals of the forum include an educated public and industry, interaction and sharing amongst industry, science, and managers, and perhaps most important, quote, an industry, the segments of which actively listen to one another and understand one another and each other's particular issues. Forum organizers make a point to explicitly state that this includes managers and the environmental community. If you're new to fisheries, and not from New England, where this is a regular topic in the general media, you may be unaware of the tension that often exists between the commercial fishing industry and regulators. Often by extension, this tension pits commercial fishers against the scientific community, and perhaps most notably, against the environmental community. While you'll certainly hear some grandstanding and polarizing pomposity at the Maine Fishermen's Forum, you'll also meet a lot of people who are truly interested in moving beyond the tension and talking to one another. I could go on, but I think Port Clyde fisherman Jerry Cushman may have said it best when he spoke from the audience to Maine Division of Marine Patrol Commissioner Patrick Kelleher during a policy update Saturday afternoon. In case you didn't get all that, Cushman said, "I want to thank Pat, you, and having everyone available here from DMR, from enforcement to science, to be able to answer questions from people. There's probably not a lot of states and a lot of industries and a lot of fisheries that get the chance to just sit there and just gab with your commissioner and get answers. If you're in the fishery and you don't know and you're not here asking, then don't bitch." And it's not just state regulators who attend the Fishermen's Forum to answer questions directly. On Friday afternoon, Chris Oliver, the Assistant Administrator for Fisheries at NOAA, along with Samuel Roach, Assistant Administrator for Regulatory Programs, also at NOAA, joined a panel of regional National Marine Fisheries Service administrators to answer questions from the audience. Given that Beyond Data is headed to Boston this weekend for a bigger picture approach to seafood, today I want to focus on the more local discussion. And I want to start with Department of Marine Patrol Commissioner Patrick Kelleher's assessment.
We're in a pretty good place right now, but we've got a lot of things that need to be discussed.
A pretty good place indeed, at least according to the department, which I'll refer to from this point on as DMR. At the Maine Fishermen's Forum, DMR reported that Maine's commercial fishing industry landed more than $500 million worth of marine resources in 2017, which is the fourth highest year ever in terms of value, and only the sixth time the fishery exceeded the $500 million mark. As expected, the lobster fishery once again led the state with nearly 111 million pounds of lobster landed, which was valued at around $450 million. I'll put the exact figures in the show notes at beyonddatapodcast.com if you're interested. If you didn't attend the Maine Fishermen's Forum and were just skimming the mainstream media headlines, you may have gotten a different takeaway. Consider, for example, the Bangor Daily News' 2 March headline, quote, "Maine's annual lobster landings drop by nearly 100 million in value," end quote. Or take the Portland Press Herald's headline on the same day, quote, "Size and value of Maine lobster haul falls sharply in 2017, end quote. Even the fishing industry media seemed to paint a less optimistic picture than DMR, with Seafood News' headline reading, quote, "Maine lobster landings fall sharply in 2017 as U.S. total supply decreases," end quote. A much smaller Maine paper, the Ellsworth American, presented a more optimistic take with their headline, quote, "2017 commercial fishing landings are fourth highest ever," end quote. But just last week, that very same paper ran an article headlined, quote, "Lower lobster catch, prices may be wake-up call for fishery," end quote. So what's the real story here? Kelleher referred to a slide during his presentation showing the last 12 years of lobster landings. From 2007 to 2012, there is a steady increase in landings, which then plateau and fall off slightly until 2016, which is the highest year on record in terms of landings and value. Both landings and value markedly drop in 2017, with landings being the lowest since 2012. Kelleher explained.
I'm not panicked about this. I think this is natural variation. We've seen 7 years in a row over 100 million pounds of landings. This is the fourth highest, I believe, on record, or sixth highest out of that 7 years.
The Bangor Daily News remarked that the drop in the value of the lobster fishery between 2016 and 2017 is the largest single-year decline in the fishery's history. I reached out to DMR to fact-check that, but I had not heard back in time for recording. Regardless, Kelleher, who remains optimistic about the resource, did express concern for Maine's working waterfronts.
Probably the thing that was concerning me the most was the fact that we lost $99 million out of the coastal economy.
As Kelleher pointed out at the beginning of his policy presentation, since 2012, when he became DMR commissioner, he's been talking about both the department and the industry at large being ready for a decline. One need look no further than southern New England to see what could, and what many still say will, happen to Maine's lobster fishery. Kelleher pointed to a recent paper by the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, or GMRI, to illustrate this point.
The most recent paper done by GMRI showed a population increase over time when they did their hindcast within their model of a 515% increase in the Gulf of Maine, where it showed, with the same technique, showing a 75% reduction in southern New England. That is That is a pretty stark contrast. And we need to have conversations in this regard to ensure that we don't duplicate what happened in southern New England.
While the drop in lobster landings this year may well be, as Kelleher indicated, natural variations, the state is carefully assessing the stock. Earlier in the day, before the policy talk, some of the state's data were presented in a DMR science update. The presentation was kicked off by DMR's lobster biologist Kathleen Reardon, who alluded to some of the complexities of coming up with an accurate lobster stock assessment in her overview of the session.
Within the state, we've really been trying to, for many years, been trying to understand what's happening at different life stages. We have many surveys, and all this information goes into the stock assessment, and we have all of these surveys that happen at different life stages. So see what's happening at settlement when they're really, really small, and then try to track those trends into sublegals, moving into adults. We can look at reproduction, like timing or rates of V-notches. And then larvae. Larvae is actually something we don't have any surveys for at the moment.
We'll get into V-notching and a few of the other terms Reardon mentioned and which you may not be familiar in a moment. But I want to focus here on one aspect of the lobster surveys that appears somewhat of an anomaly: the settlement surveys. Robert Russell is the coordinator for the Lobster Settlement Survey, which he described as,
so it's effectively like ripping apart a rock wall looking for spiders.
Like many marine species, lobster emerge from eggs as larvae, develop, and then settle onto substrate or bottom that affords them protection from predators, strong currents, and other threats to the vulnerable young lobster. In general, we're talking about a boulder, cobblestone, and rubble habitat, hence Russell's description of settlement surveys being a lot like ripping apart a rock wall. These so-called young-of-year lobsters are not able to be sampled via other methods such as trawl and trap surveys because of both their size and the complexity of the habitat. As a result, the settlement surveys are carried out by divers that use suction devices to locate and then ultimately count all the young of year in a half-meter square survey area. There are 40 fixed survey sites along the coast of Maine that have been surveyed every year since 2001, with 8 of those sites having been surveyed since 1989. That's a lot of work, and those data are critical. So what did the data from 2017 settlement surveys show? And I apologize for the background noise in this next clip. There was a rather raucous seminar next door featuring a flamboyant chef with Sicilian roots.
We are down again. It's the 4th year. I'm kind of the oddball out. The other surveys that we have are showing some of the general trends upwards in some ways. The thing that I guess I would like to make note of is that when I hear this in some media stories or I hear from conversations I have with people, they're like, oh yeah, it's the 4th year in a row that we're down. And I would say it's the 4th year in a row that we're below average.
So the settlement surveys are showing there are less young-of-year lobster in the survey sites, and potentially this would mean bad news for the stock and for the fishery, as less baby lobsters obviously mean less adult lobsters in the future. To emphasize what Russell said, we need to take a look at the big picture here and realize that while the data may show settlement is down, the data are not that far off from the long-term averages. Still, the data suggests lobster settlement is below average, and it's been bouncing around in that below average realm. What might that mean? And does it allude to that more dramatic decline for which Kelleher says DMR is preparing?
So then you have to ask yourself, well, what's happening? Are they actually not there? Are they there and you don't know how to identify them anymore? And I'll get into that in a minute. Are they a different size? Or are they in a different location and not where you think they're going to be?
Really answering this question would require a full episode in and of itself. But in short, the point that Russell is making here is really important when it comes to fisheries data. These data are complex because the animals themselves and the environments in which they live are complex. It's important to know that the settlement surveys are down, and generally have been down over the last several years. But it's equally important to not draw a hasty conclusion from those data. Keep in mind that it takes many years for a lobster to make it from settlement to the size where that lobster may end up in a trap, and perhaps even longer until it is large enough to be kept. Immediately assuming that low settlement surveys mean less lobsters are settling and that subsequently less lobsters will come into the fishery in the future can lead to alarm and even reactionary policy that may not be warranted. We know, for example, that there are plenty of breeding females in the Gulf of Maine, perhaps even a record number. Are we therefore experiencing a massive larval or post-larval mortality event, perhaps precipitated by a scarcity of prey on which the tiny lobsters depend? That's one question scientists might ask. But what if other factors such as temperature, and we know the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than many other marine environments on Earth right now, what if those temperature changes are causing post-larval lobsters to settle at different times, or grow faster, or settle at different depths? What if the young of year are simply expanding their habitat, or growing to a length by the time of the survey that removes them from the traditional young of year size class? These are all great questions, but we're going to leave them as questions here. We'll come back to some of them in future episodes of Beyond Data, but for now, I want to return to Commissioner Kelleher's sentiment.
If we were talking about a stoplight scenario, we're not in a red light scenario where we're under an emergency, but it's always good to have these conversations and be prepared for change if we need to see change.
When Kelleher speaks with the commercial fishing industry in Maine, he talks a lot about resiliency and being proactive. Part of that has to do with his stated goal since the beginning of his time as commissioner of being ready for decline. The lobster fishery is experiencing a boom right now, and as we all know, booms don't last forever. At some point in the future, landings will decline. Likely, so too will the fishery's value. I think the salient question, therefore, is what will that decline look like? Will it be a bust, as some have suggested? Is it just a matter of time before the Gulf of Maine lobster fishery suffers a similar fate to that of southern New England's lobster fishery? In many ways, the media in general has been, not unlike Kelleher, ready for this decline. And maybe that's why the drop in landings in the fishery this year so readily garnered alarmist headlines in the absence of really delving into the complexities of both the data and the stories direct from those who are on the water on a near-daily basis. Part of the difference, perhaps, between the media and Kelleher is that focus on resiliency, and it's a story that probably doesn't get told enough. Make no doubt, Maine's lobster fishery is not perfect, and as Kelleher stated at the outset, there is a lot we need to discuss. But one thing Maine has gotten right is some of the management measures put in place to make the stock more resilient. In Maine, for example, there is a mandatory V-notching requirement, whereby fishers make a small V-shaped notch in one of the tail flippers of all egg-bearing female lobsters before they release them. There is also a maximum size limit that is generally more conservative than in other fisheries. Dr. Andrew Pershing of GMRI and his colleagues recently took both of these management strategies and plugged them into their model in an effort to get a sense of how things may have been different if Maine's management measures had been used in southern New England, and if southern New England's management measures had been used in Maine.
One of the neat things we can do in a model is we can actually swap things around. So we did an experiment in the model where we took the management strategy in the north and said, what if southern New England had caught lobsters the way that fishermen in Maine have been catching lobsters in terms of discarding the larger lobsters and marking the females? What if Maine had the same rules as southern New England where you were keeping some of the larger lobsters in and the V-notching rates were lower? And if you do that, you see that in Maine, we would have had fewer lobsters. We would not have taken advantage of the increase in the fishery over the last few years. And in southern New England, they would have been able to hold on to more of their fishery.
According to Pershing and his colleagues, the data suggests the boom the Maine lobster fishery is currently experiencing may have a lot to do with how the management measures in Maine have built stock resiliency. So obviously, keeping those measures in place is something that appears to be supported by the data. But what about the temperature changes and the influx of species from the south like black sea bass that may provide new challenges to the lobster stock? Is a bust in the future? Pershing doesn't think so, and he explained why. By plugging 3 different climate scenarios into his model, a mild, a medium, and a hot, he was able to forecast the future of the lobster stock based on each scenario.
So all of these models suggest that with continued warming, that we're going to see a decline in the abundance of lobsters in Maine. But the surprising thing to me was how gradual this decline was. Ever since I've been working in Maine now for about 12 years, people have been speculating about what warmer temperatures are going to mean for lobsters and what this might mean for this fishery. And I think, at least in my head, I had the idea of a really abrupt decline. but when we put this through our model, we actually get a very gradual decline, where in the warm case, which is the mild warming scenario, you're kind of rewinding back to the abundances that we had in right around 2010. In the medium scenario, which is the most likely one, by 2050, you're kind of rewinding back to conditions in the early 2000s. And even in the hot scenario, you're going back to the abundances that we had in the 1990s.
Of course, Pershing says, these projections only hold true if current management measures remain in place.
The most important message from the modeling work that we've done, and this was a real surprise to us when we were putting this together, was how critical the conservation practices that fishermen here in Maine have been pushing for generations are to making this fishery resilient to climate variability and change. Without the V-notching, without the really strong slot limit, this fishery would not have experienced the boom times that we're currently in. And if those practices continue, you get a decline back to levels that are recognizable from this fishery. You don't get that big cliff, at least according to our models.
The Maine Fishermen's Forum is a 3-day event with seminar sessions running concurrently. I've not tried to present a comprehensive overview of the forum in today's special episode, but rather I've focused on one fairly narrowly defined topic that has huge implications for Maine's working waterfronts. It also is a national story when one considers that in 2016, American lobster was the species of highest landed value in the U.S., and Maine's catch represented 80% of that value. As I mentioned, Maine's lobster fishery is not perfect and not without debate. And I'll close this special episode of the Beyond Data podcast by introducing the biggest issue facing Maine's lobster industry in the short term. Before I do that, however, I want to briefly address an issue that is near and dear to my heart.
There's nothing better than proving the scientists is wrong. And it's a mission. The whole crew was like, I think we got one of those. That thing said it isn't here. Take a picture. So it's, it's really fun that way. So
There's nothing better than proving the scientists wrong is a relatively common sentiment I've heard from fishers over years of reporting on fisheries at the intersection of science and sustainability. In part, this has to do with the fact that fishermen, like Captain John Peabody, who you heard in that clip, often say that what they see while fishing is significantly different from the data used to regulate the fishery. In an era where the New England commercial fishing industry has seen drastic quota reductions across numerous fisheries, there is an understandable skepticism regarding what those who are catching the fish are saying versus what those who are counting the fish are saying. There are also many legitimate reasons why the two perspectives may not appear to match up. For one, there is often a lag time between doing science and publishing science. Then there is the issue of looking at a fishery through a hyper-local lens, like a captain who is infinitely familiar with the grounds he or she fishes, versus a regional lens, like the one on which scientists are often focused. The reality is that both perspectives are important, and fisheries management gets better when adaptive management is informed by both the scientific community and the fishing community. On Saturday morning, there was a session titled Embracing Ecosystem Change. Can Jonah crab, black sea bass, and fishing communities get along? The session itself was fascinating and critically important, but I'm not going to get too far into the subject matter here. Instead, I want to focus on the big picture. For someone walking into this session off the street, the anti-science sentiment expressed by a panel of commercial fishermen like Captain Peabody was palpable. But the context of the session reveals, I believe, a very different dynamic. Based on my discussion with several audience members after the session, that takeaway may have been lost on many. The session's panel of commercial fishermen were all involved with research carried out through the Rhode Island-based Commercial Fisheries Research Foundation. CFRF is a nonprofit private foundation established, quote, by commercial fishermen to conduct collaborative fisheries research and education projects, end quote. Here's Norbert Stamps of the Atlantic Offshore Lobstermen's Association talking about his motivation for working with CFRF.
I don't know if everybody in this room understands that they wanted to shut down the southern New England lobster fishery 100%. And that's kind of when we got a little motivated on the research stuff. I think, John, I think all of us in the program look at this as bullets in our gun. You know, this is a fisherman-run organization, which means the research center owns that data. Doesn't get hidden, doesn't get used in the way that it wasn't meant to be used. This is raw data that the fishermen own, okay? So, like John says, there's nothing better than proving them wrong, which we've done a few times. And I think it's invaluable. It is a pain in the ass collecting the data.
But it's satisfying.
You know, it's you have to do it. I don't see any other way. You have to do it. I know you guys have a great relationship with your DMR, and there's a lot of stuff at the Lobster Institute and the University of Maine. You don't own that data. It makes a big difference.
My takeaway from the session was that rather than setting up the polarized position of us versus them, commercial fisheries versus science, the reality is that these commercial fishermen are doing science. At its basis level, science is about scientists proving scientists wrong. That's really the whole point. And it doesn't have to be about animosity. More data are often better than fewer data. And if the data set doesn't match one's observations, then formulate a new question and go out and get the data that either supports or refutes the hypothesis. That's science. And from my perspective, that's exactly what these fishermen working with CFRF are doing. I'm going to bring this episode to a close by briefly mentioning what may be the single largest issue that will face Maine's commercial fishing industry over the next few years: right whale entanglements.
This will be the largest challenge for this industry, will be how we're going to deal with Atlantic right whales. The industry has 2 decades of participation in compliance with right whales. We've been very engaged for a long time, and I don't expect that to stop. In fact, this industry now needs to remain very united on what type of approach we'll take to deal with this.
The issue in a nutshell is this, as Dr. Mark Baumgartner of Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute put it during a contentious Friday seminar. The data are ringing alarm bells. Right whales are facing extinction, and too many are dying after becoming entangled in fishing gear.
And so if we just do a simple calculation, how long will those 105 breeding females that are alive today last? If they're dying at a rate of 4.6 per year, it's only 23 years. So what does that mean? If we do nothing, if mortality rates stay the way they are, we'll wipe out those 105 breeding females that were alive in 2015 and 23 years. And so roughly in 20 years, the population will be what we call functionally extinct or unable to recover, because most of the females will be gone. Not all the females, but most of them. So I take away from that we have years, not decades, to fix this problem. And the longer we wait, the harder the problem will be to fix, because every female you kill off all the calves that she could have had if she had lived a full lifetime.
Later in the seminar, Amy Knowlton of the New England Aquarium stated that the data show 85% of the population of right whales in the Atlantic has become entangled in fishing gear at least once. She said the entanglements have become more complex and more lethal over the years. In his policy talk, DMR Commissioner Kelleher laid out the challenges to the Maine fishing industry, and especially the lobster fishery, given that both the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act cover the right whale entanglement issue. There is pending legal action brought forward by NGOs. There are a lot of questions about the data. There are solutions that may provide for the protection of both whales and fishing, but there are more questions than answers about many of those solutions at present. The message at the Fishermen's Forum from Maine regulators in the Maine commercial fishing industry is that right whale entanglements are a serious issue, but also that Maine is working diligently and proactively toward workable solutions. During the Q&A session of his policy talk, Kelleher addressed a concern shared by many in the fishing industry. The press, he said, is only telling one side of the story. I'll let Kelleher pick it up from there.
Jeff Nichols, who is here in the room, who's the communications director from the at 5 o'clock every morning, I get an email from Jeff, what's in the news? And there were, I don't know, nearly 30 in the that 24-hour news cycle. There were nearly 30 whale stories. Not about how great you guys do, but about entanglements. It's tough to see, but entanglement issues, calving rate issues, mortality issues, all real things, but not one story talking about the work that this industry's already done.
Right, that's what I was getting
Yeah,
at.
and when I came downstairs last night to have a conversation, I get stopped by a reporter in the hallway, and he said, "Wow, it seems like you guys are doing a lot of work based on that presentation." And I did. I said, "Yeah. I mean, if you look at the work you've done on moving away from float rope and going to sinking ground lines, and having to deal with all those issues associated with transitioning from float rope to sinking ground lines, the trawling out work that we've just done, the compliance issues, the breakaways, all of that work is great work. Is it enough?" Yesterday during the presentation, my phone blew up from my staff saying this is not a great representation of the true story in regards to entanglements, because much of the data that they showed for the U.S. we know is Canadian gear. It was just found in the U.S. So we need to scrub that data. We need to make sure we understand that data and what it says, and frankly, that's our role and the TRT's role in interacting with the National Marine Fisheries Service to make sure that they're using that data correctly. But to your point, the news piece, Jeff, get on that for Christ's sakes.
Based on hearing the commissioner and others speak, I'm pleased to announce that the 8th and final episode of the first season of the Beyond Data podcast is going to take a deep dive into the right whale entanglement issue. We won't shy away from the complexities, and we'll seek to tell the whole story based on both the data and the stories of those on the water. If you'd like to weigh in between now and June when the episode is scheduled to publish, feel free to send me an email to rhett@rhetttalbot.com or call the Beyond Data voicemail line and leave me a message. The number is 207-370-1575. Again, that's 207-370-1575. Stay tuned for more seafood and fishery news coming throughout the month of March, and then for the full episode at the end of this month. To see graphs and get links for organizations, scientific papers, and people mentioned in today's episode, please visit www.beyonddatapodcast.com. And be sure to follow me on Twitter at Rhett Talbot for live tweets starting Sunday from the Seafood Expo North America in Boston. Thanks to the Maine Fishermen's Forum for another great event, and to Andy Cohen for the music in today's podcast. Beyond Data is reported, narrated, and produced by me, Rhett Talbot, in Rockland, Maine. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please tell a friend about it, and consider subscribing on Apple Podcasts, where you can also help out the show by rating it and giving us a review. That really does make a difference. Thanks.